The morning bell at Northland High didn't just ring, it seemed to rattle the teeth of everyone in the hallway. It was a harsh, metallic sound that signaled the start of another noisy day. Lockers slammed shut with the force of cannon fire, and sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor as students rushed to their first classes. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax, old gym clothes, and the overwhelming energy of hundreds of teenagers talking all at once. To most people here, this noise was normal. It was the soundtrack of their lives. But for Maya, it felt like a physical assault. Maya walked through the chaos like a ghost. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, and she had a way of folding her shoulders in that made her seem even smaller. She kept her head down, her dark hair falling forward to curtain her face, creating a tiny, private world between her eyes and the floor. She wore a large, gray zip-up hoodie that was 2 sizes too big for her, the sleeves pulled down over her hands. It was her armor. As long as she stayed hidden inside that hoodie, she was safe from the noise and the eyes. She moved along the lockers, hugging the wall, careful not to touch anyone. In a school where everyone was jostling for space and attention, being invisible was a skill she had perfected over years. "Excuse me," someone might say, bumping into her shoulder. Maya would just mumble a quick, breathless sorry and slip away before they even realized who she was. She didn't have enemies, but she didn't really have friends either. She was just background scenery. A piece of furniture that everyone walked past without a second glance. At the end of the hallway, the double glass doors to the auditorium stood open. Inside, the lights were already up. Mr. Henderson, the drama teacher, was standing on the stage. He was a large man with a booming voice that could cut through concrete. He was pacing back and forth, clapping his hands together with a sharp smack 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 that demanded attention. He was getting ready for the annual Regional Talent Showcase, the biggest event of the year, and the atmosphere in the room was electric. "Energy, people. I need energy," Mr. Henderson shouted, spreading his arms wide. His voice echoed off the velvet curtains. "This isn't a library. This is a stage. We need presence. We need charisma. If you can't project your voice to the cheap seats, you shouldn't be up here." Maya lingered near the entrance, just outside the bright rectangle of light that spilled onto the floor. She liked it here. She liked to watch. There was something magical about the stage, even when it was empty. It felt like a separate world, a place where stories happened, unlike her life which was just a series of quiet moments. She clutched a soft, worn notebook against her chest. The cover was peeling at the corners, and the pages were dog-eared. It was her most precious possession. The drama club was gathered on the stage, a mix of boys and girls in bright clothes, laughing loudly and practicing their lines. They were the popular kids, the ones who commanded attention the moment they walked into a cafeteria. They were loud, confident, and bright. They were everything Maya was not. "All right, listen up," Mr. Henderson said, stopping his pacing. He picked up a stack of permission slips from a music stand. "The auditions for the showcase are on Friday. I want this school to win this year. I'm tired of coming in second place to Central High. I want big voices. I want personalities. I want people who can own the room." He started handing out the papers. The students on stage grabbed them eagerly, talking about what songs they were going to sing or what monologues they were going to perform. 2 girls, laughing, started singing a pop song at the top of their lungs, their voices harmonizing perfectly, though they were mostly showing off. Maya took a small step forward. Her heart gave a strange, fluttering thump against her ribs. She watched the papers being passed around. For the last 3 years, she had stood in this exact spot and watched. For the last 3 years, she had told herself that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year she would walk up those stairs, take a paper, and sign her name. She opened her mouth slightly, just a fraction, as if she were about to speak. Mr. Henderson, she thought, but the words didn't leave her throat. It felt like someone was squeezing her neck. And none of this wallflower business, Mr. Henderson continued, waving a hand dismissively toward the back of the room. He didn't see Maya standing in the shadows. The stage is no place for shy people. If you're too quiet to say hello in the hallway, you're definitely too quiet to perform in front of 500 people. I need stars. A few students laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, really. It was just an agreement. It was obvious to everyone there that the stage belonged to the loud. Maya froze. The words hit her like a bucket of ice water. Too quiet. That was the label she had been carrying since elementary school. Teachers wrote it on her report cards, Maya is a pleasure to have in class, but she is too quiet. Relatives said it at family gatherings, oh, Maya, you're so quiet, speak up. She looked down at her notebook. Inside, hidden between the lines, were words she had written. Lyrics. Melodies that played in her head when she couldn't sleep at night. They were loud in her mind. They screamed and cried and soared. But whenever she tried to let them out, they got stuck in the filter of her shyness. The thought of standing under those hot lights, with hundreds of eyes staring at her, waiting for her to speak, made her stomach turn into a knot. Mr. Henderson turned to a tall boy with a guitar case strapped to his back. Tom, you're taking a stack for the band room, he ordered. Make sure everyone signs up. We need volume. Tom took the papers, jumped off the stage, and walked right past Maya without even noticing she was there. He was busy looking at his phone, laughing at a text message. Maya watched him go. The opportunity was slipping away, just like it always did. The distance between the edge of the light where she stood and the stage seemed like 1,000 miles. It was a barrier she couldn't cross. The noise in the hallway seemed to get louder again, rushing back into her ears. She tightened her grip on the notebook. She could feel the shape of her pen inside the front cover. She had practiced. She had practiced in her bedroom with the door locked. She had practiced in the shower. She had practiced in the old, empty storage closet under the stairs where no one ever went. She knew she could do it. But knowing it and doing it were two very different things. Okay, everyone, break. Mr. Henderson clapped his hands again. Remember, big voices. Big personalities. The group on stage broke apart, laughing and chatting as they filed out the side exit. The noise level rose as they flooded back into the hallway. Maya shrank back against the wall, pulling her hoodie tighter around herself. She waited until the rush of students passed. She waited until Mr. Henderson turned his back to adjust something on the soundboard. She stood there for a long minute, just breathing. The urge to walk up there was fighting a losing battle against the fear in her chest. Finally, she let out a long, shaky breath. It was no use. She wasn't a star. She was just the quiet girl in the gray hoodie. Maya turned away from the auditorium. She walked out the side exit, pushing the metal bar on the glass door. The cool autumn air hit her face, sharp and refreshing, waking her up from the daydream. Outside, the school grounds were busy. Students were sitting on benches, throwing footballs, shouting across the lawn. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the pavement, navigating the cracks in the concrete, counting her steps to keep her mind calm. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. 4, 5, 6. Keep walking. She made her way to the far edge of the school property, past the football field where the marching band was practicing a loud, brassy fight song. She went around the back of the vocational building, to a place where the noise of the school faded into a dull hum. There was a set of concrete steps that led down to the old boiler room. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and machinery. No one ever came down here unless they had to. Maya sat down on the bottom step. It was cold and hard through her jeans, but she didn't mind. Down here, in the cool shadows, the pressure in her chest began to loosen. She opened her notebook. The pages were filled with her handwriting, messy and cramped, squeezed into the margins. Notes scribbled in pencil, lyrics scratched out and rewritten. She looked at the words she had written last night. They tell you to be loud, they tell you to shine, but the sun burns too bright sometimes. She hummed a low, soft note. It was so quiet that she could barely hear it herself over the distant thumping of the bass drums from the football field. She closed her eyes and let the melody build in her head. It was a sad song, but there was a strength to it. It was the sound of the things she wanted to say but couldn't. For a few minutes, she just sat there, humming, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on her knee. This was her stage. The cold concrete steps. The shadows. The silence. It was safe. It was enough. She wasn't the girl who silenced the world. Not yet. Right now, she was just Maya, the quiet one, sitting alone with her secrets, while the rest of the world rushed by, shouting to be heard. The lunch bell rang, releasing a tidal wave of students into the corridors. It was the loudest part of the day, a chaotic mix of shouting, laughing, and the slamming of metal locker doors. For the girl who usually kept her head down and her hood up, this was the worst time to be in the hallways. She was pushed and jostled as she made her way against the current, clutching her brown paper lunch bag like a shield. She didn't go to the cafeteria. She never did. The cafeteria was a sensory nightmare: bright lights, clattering trays, and the constant pressure to perform socially, even if you were just sitting alone. Instead, she slipped through a side exit near the science labs. The heavy door closed behind her, cutting off the noise instantly. It was like stepping out of a storm and into a vacuum. She took a deep breath of the crisp air, letting the tension in her shoulders drop. She walked around the side of the building to a place most students forgot existed. Down a narrow, gravel path behind the old vocational workshops, there was a rusted set of steel doors leading to the sub-basement. It was technically for maintenance, but the lock had been broken for years. She pulled the heavy door open and stepped into the cool, damp air of the basement. It smelled of concrete, old dust, and the faint metallic tang of the heating pipes. It was dimly lit, with bare bulbs flickering every now and then, casting long, dancing shadows against the brick walls. This was her sanctuary. Down here, no one expected her to be loud. No one expected her to be anything. She could just be. She sat on her usual spot, an overturned plastic crate near the old boilers. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hers. She slowly ate her sandwich, listening to the low hum of the building's machinery. It was a rhythmic, soothing sound, like a giant breathing while it slept. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and pulled the worn notebook from her backpack. She flipped past the pages filled with doodles and half-finished math problems until she found the blank pages at the back. This was where she kept her other life. While her outside life was silent and gray, her inside life was a riot of color and sound. She wrote lyrics about the things she couldn't say. She wrote about the weight of silence, about the colors of sound, about feeling like a ghost in a room full of living people. But today, the words on the paper didn't feel like enough. The melody in her head was getting louder, insistent and demanding. It had been stuck there for days, a looping tune that made her fingers itch. She needed to hear it, not just think it. She stood up and walked deeper into the basement, past the storage shelves filled with old cleaning supplies and broken chairs. In the far corner, hidden behind a stack of dusty floor mats, she saw it. It was a keyboard, an old electric model that must have been down here for a decade. It was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, and the power cord was tangled around the legs like a dead vine. She had seen it before, but she had never dared to touch it. It looked like it belonged to a different era. But today, the pull was too strong. She walked over and set her notebook on a stack of boxes. Carefully, she pulled the dust cloth off. The keys were yellowed with age, and some of the labels had worn off, but it looked intact. She found the power switch, a little red knob on the back panel, and turned it. A small orange light flickered on. It blinked a few times, struggling to life, and then stayed steady. A low, static hum came from the small speaker on the back. Her heart beat a little faster. She reached out and pressed a key. A tinny, slightly out of tune piano sound echoed in the empty room. It wasn't a concert grand, but it worked. She wiped the keys with the sleeve of her hoodie, trying to clean off the worst of the dirt. Then, she sat on a wooden crate in front of it. She placed her fingers on the cool plastic. She didn't know how to read music properly, she had never taken a lesson. But she knew where the notes were supposed to be in her head. She closed her eyes and let her hands find their way. She started with the bass line, a low, rumbling sequence of notes that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like thunder rolling in from a distance. Then, she added the melody with her right hand. It was simple at first, exploring the range of the instrument, finding the sound that matched the tune in her head. The keyboard was touch sensitive, and she realized she had to press harder to make it loud. She pushed down on the keys, putting the weight of her small body into the music. The sound filled the small concrete room, bouncing off the low ceiling. It wasn't a beautiful sound in a classical sense, it was rough and unpolished, but it was real. Then, she opened her mouth. Her speaking voice was a whisper, a fragile thing that broke easily. But her singing voice was different. It came from a deeper place, a place that didn't care about being shy. She started to sing the words she had written that morning. Her voice was surprisingly rich, with a smoky texture to it that cut through the tinny speaker of the keyboard. They tell you to be loud, she sang, her voice gaining confidence as she hit the chorus. They tell you to shine. But the sun burns too bright sometimes. She wasn't performing. There was no audience here, no judges, no popular kids to impress. She was just letting the sound out of her body. It felt like opening a valve on a pressure cooker. The anxiety of the day, the frustration of being invisible, the loneliness of the lunch break, it all poured out through her fingers and her voice. She lost track of time. The song grew louder and more complex. She experimented with hitting the keys harder, making the music crash like waves. She sang high notes that she didn't know she could reach, holding them until her lungs burned. In this damp, dusty basement, she wasn't the quiet girl in the gray hoodie anymore. She was giant. She was powerful. She was the only thing that mattered in the world. The keyboard's volume knob was turned all the way up, and the small speaker buzzed in protest, but she didn't care. She closed her eyes tight, tilting her head back, letting a particularly long note hang in the air. It was a note of pure longing, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very dust motes dancing in the light. She poured everything into that moment. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room, drowning out the hum of the boiler and the distant sounds of the school above. She felt free. It was a feeling she rarely experienced, a feeling of being completely, unapologetically herself. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching on the concrete floor outside. She didn't hear the slight creak of the metal door being pushed open. She was too far gone in the music, lost in a world of her own creation. The song reached its climax, a flurry of chords and a soaring vocal line that felt like she was flying. And then, abruptly, the song ended. She let the final chord ring out, her foot resting heavily on the sustain pedal. She sat there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now. It felt like the silence was listening to her. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, savoring the feeling, the echo of the music still ringing in her ears. She felt lighter, as if she had shed a heavy coat. This was what she was meant to do. It didn't matter if she couldn't speak up in class. It didn't matter if she was invisible in the hallways. Here, with her fingers on the keys and the sound in her throat, she had a voice that roared. She finally opened her eyes, expecting to see the same dark, empty corner she always saw. She expected to gather her things, slip her hood back up, and sneak back into the school before the bell rang. She expected to go back to being invisible. But as her vision adjusted, she saw something in the shadows near the doorway. A movement. A figure standing there, still and silent. Her heart stopped. The blood drained from her face. The spell was broken. The heavy silence in the room suddenly felt very heavy indeed. She froze, her hands still poised over the dusty keys, realizing that for the first time, her secret world had been invaded. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy and suffocating, like a thick wool blanket thrown over her head. The girl sat frozen on the wooden crate, her fingers hovering over the yellowed keys of the old keyboard. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might bruise them from the inside. The song she had just sung, the roar of emotion that had felt so powerful just seconds ago, now seemed like a terrible mistake. It felt naked and exposed. She stared into the shadows near the doorway. The figure stepped forward, the dusty light from the bare bulb catching the side of his face. It was a boy from her history class. She knew his face, but she didn't really know him. He was one of the popular ones, always wearing a varsity jacket and laughing loudly in the hallways. He usually moved with the confidence of someone who owned the world, but right now, he looked different. He looked stunned. He had been looking for a spare music stand, that much was obvious. He was holding a piece of paper in his hand, a checklist for the stage crew, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at her. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, as if he had just seen a ghost or a UFO. He had walked in expecting to find an empty storage room, maybe some rats, but certainly not this. The girl felt her face burn with a heat so intense it was painful. Her instinct screamed at her to run. She wanted to grab her backpack, push past him, and sprint up the stairs and out of the building. She wanted to disappear, to vaporize into the dust motes floating in the air. That was her defense mechanism. That was what she always did. She pulled her hands back from the keyboard as if the keys had suddenly turned red hot. I was just leaving, she stammered. Her voice was tiny and trembling, the complete opposite of the powerful voice that had been filling the room just moments before. She scrambled off the crate, her movements clumsy and frantic. She grabbed her worn notebook, shoving it into her backpack with shaking hands. The boy took a step forward, blocking the easy path to the door. "Wait," he said. His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't loud or booming like it usually was in the cafeteria. It was quiet, almost reverent. She flinched, pulling the hood of her gray sweatshirt up over her head. She couldn't look him in the eye. She looked at his sneakers instead. "Please, I have to go," she whispered. She felt the tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She hated this feeling. She hated feeling so small and weak. She had just felt like a giant, and now she felt like an insect under a microscope. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. He took another step closer, but he stopped when he saw her shrink away. He leaned back against a stack of folding chairs, crossing his arms. He wasn't looking at her with the usual pity or amusement people had when they noticed her. He was looking at her with confusion and awe. "I was just looking for a stand for the amps. I heard. I thought it was a radio." The girl gripped the straps of her backpack until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to tell him that it was none of his business. But the words were stuck in her throat. The irony tasted bitter. She had just sung a whole song about wanting to be heard, and now that someone had actually heard her, she wanted to hide. The reality of it was terrifying. "You have to audition," the boy said. The words hung in the damp air. The girl blinked, finally looking up. She expected him to laugh. She expected him to say, "Just kidding, you're terrible." That was how the world worked in her experience. But his face was serious. He pushed his hand through his hair, shaking his head slowly. "For the showcase," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling where the auditorium was. "Mr. Henderson is losing his mind trying to find someone to open the show. The people we have, they're okay, but they're not that." He pointed a finger at the dusty keyboard. She stared at him. The thought had crossed her mind 1,000 times, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep. But hearing it said out loud, by him of all people, felt surreal. "I can't," she said quickly. I'm not a performer. I can't even talk in class." "That's insane," he said, pushing off the chairs. He walked over to the keyboard. He didn't touch it, but he looked at it with respect. "You were screaming without opening your mouth down here. That's what music is supposed to do. My sister sings, and she takes lessons, and she practices scales for hours. But she doesn't have, whatever that was." He looked back at her, and for the first time, he really saw her. Not as the quiet ghost in the hallway, but as a person. "You have to do it." She shook her head frantically. "No. I'll mess up. I'll freeze. Everyone will look at me." "Everyone looks at everyone on stage," he said, shrugging. "That's the point. But if you sound like that, they won't be laughing. They'll be listening." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled permission slip. It was the same paper Mr. Henderson had been handing out on stage, the one she had been too afraid to take. He smoothed it out against his knee and held it out to her. "Please," she said, backing away. "I can't." "I'm not taking no for an answer," he said. There was a stubbornness in his voice that she recognized. It was the voice of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, but for once, it didn't feel annoying. It felt like he was on her side. Look, if you audition and you hate it, you never have to do it again. But if you don't go, you're going to sit down here every day for the rest of your life and wonder what would have happened. He stepped closer and gently pressed the paper into her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and for a second, the transfer of energy felt electric. Friday. After school. Just, don't tell anyone I told you to come. Henderson hates it when I do the recruiting. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, maybe waiting for her to say something else. But she didn't trust her voice. She just clutched the paper, her fingers tight around the edges. The boy nodded once, a short, sharp nod. All right then. I'm gonna go find that stand. He turned and walked away, his sneakers crunching on the concrete floor. He pushed the heavy metal door open, letting in a slice of bright daylight and a burst of noise from the schoolyard, and then he was gone. The door swung shut, plunging the room back into semi-darkness. The girl stood alone again in the silence. The hum of the boiler returned, sounding louder now. She looked down at her hand. The permission slip was wrinkled, with a coffee stain in the corner. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt heavy. It felt dangerous. She looked at the keyboard, then back at the door. Her heart was still racing, but the panic was starting to mix with something else. A tiny, flickering spark. Fear, yes. But also a strange kind of hope. For the first time, someone had seen her. Really seen her. And they hadn't looked away. She carefully folded the permission slip and slid it into the front pocket of her notebook. Then, she shouldered her bag and walked up the stairs, leaving the basement behind. As she stepped out into the bright, chaotic afternoon, the world didn't look exactly the same. The noise was still there, the people were still rushing past, but she held a secret now. She had an invitation. The day of the audition arrived under a sky of bruised gray clouds, matching the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in the girl's stomach. She had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning while melodies and worries chased each other in circles. Now, standing in the long, dim hallway outside the auditorium, she felt like she might throw up. She wore her usual gray hoodie, the sleeves pulled down over her hands, but she had made one small concession to the occasion: she was wearing her cleanest pair of jeans. The hallway was crowded with students. They were stretching their vocal cords with loud scales, plucking at guitar strings, and adjusting their costumes. The air smelled of hairspray, nervous sweat, and anticipation. It was a cacophony of noise and confidence. Laughter bounced off the lockers as groups of friends joked to hide their own nerves. The girl stood by the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. She clutched her notebook tightly to her chest, feeling the crinkle of the permission slip tucked inside. She was an island of silence in a sea of noise. Every time someone laughed or shouted, she flinched slightly. She felt like a spy who had infiltrated a foreign country, terrified that at any moment, someone would point at her and shout, "You don't belong here." The double doors to the auditorium opened, and a student walked out, looking dejected. The audition monitor, a senior with a clipboard, looked down the list. "Okay, next up is," she paused, squinting at the name, "the new girl. You're on." A hush fell over the group nearest the door. Heads turned. Whispers started instantly. She didn't have a real reputation, but everyone knew the quiet girl. They exchanged glances, raising eyebrows. Some looked confused, others looked amused. the boy who had found her in the basement was standing a little further down the hall, talking to a few friends. When he heard her name, he stopped talking. He looked over at her and gave a short, encouraging nod. It was a small gesture, but it was the only thing keeping her feet glued to the floor. She took a breath that didn't seem to bring any oxygen into her lungs. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the open doors. As she passed the clusters of students, the whispers grew louder. "Is she serious? I didn't know she even spoke. This is going to be a disaster." She ignored them. She focused on the scuff marks on the tiled floor, one step at a time. Left foot, right foot. Breathe. Walking into the auditorium was like walking into a different atmosphere. The sheer size of the room was intimidating. The stage loomed ahead, a vast, empty platform surrounded by heavy velvet curtains. The seats were filled with other students waiting for their turn, plus a few teachers and the drama club members who had come to watch the chaos. It wasn't a full house, but to her, it looked like a stadium. At the long judges' table sat Mr. Henderson, the drama teacher. He looked tired. He was sipping from a large plastic cup, tapping a pen rhythmically against his clipboard. Next to him sat the choir director and the student council president. They looked bored, having sat through hours of average singing and mediocre acting. The girl climbed the side steps to the stage. Every step felt like walking up a mountain. Her sneakers made no sound on the wooden floor, which only made her feel smaller. She walked to the center mark, a piece of bright blue tape on the floor. She stood there for a moment, blinded by the bright stage lights. She couldn't see the audience clearly, they were just a mass of shapes in the darkness beyond the glare. She didn't have a backing track. She didn't have an instrument. She had requested a microphone stand earlier that morning, and a janitor had set it up for her. It was a simple, black metal stand. She reached out with a trembling hand and adjusted the height, pulling the microphone down to her level. Mr. Henderson looked up from his clipboard. He sighed audibly, the sound echoing slightly in the large room. "Name?" he asked, his voice flat. She started, then cleared her throat. Her voice squeaked. She winced. "It's me. From history." Mr. Henderson squinted against the lights. "Ah, right. The quiet one. Okay, then. Whenever you're ready. Remember, project. We need to hear you in the back row. If you're going to whisper, you might as well walk off now." A few people in the front rows tittered with laughter. The sound hit her like a physical slap. Her hands were sweating, making the microphone feel slippery. She looked out at the rows of faces. Some were checking their phones. Others were whispering to their neighbors. They were waiting for the awkward pause, the mistake, the reason to stop paying attention. Her instinct was to run. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, a rhythmic thumping that drowned out the silence of the room. "Just go," a voice in her head said. "Run back to the basement. Run back to safety." But then she closed her eyes. The bright lights turned her eyelids a warm red. She took a deep breath, smelling the dust of the stage curtains and the old wood. She remembered the feeling of the cool keys under her fingers in the basement. She remembered the freedom of that moment. She remembered the boy in the hallway telling her that she had to do this. She wasn't here for the people in the front row checking their phones. She wasn't here for Mr. Henderson or his boredom. She was here for the silence that lived inside her. She was here to let it out. She adjusted her grip on the microphone stand. She curled her free hand into a fist at her side, digging her fingernails into her palm to ground herself. The shaking in her hands didn't stop, but she decided it didn't matter. She didn't need to be perfectly still. She just needed to be true. She opened her eyes. She didn't look at the judges. She didn't look at the popular kids in the front row. She looked past them, looking at the very back wall of the auditorium, high up in the rafters where the shadows were deepest. The room was quiet, waiting for her to fail. The air was thick with skepticism. She stood there, small and alone in the pool of light, and she prepared to tear the silence apart. She didn't count off 1, 2, 3, 4. She didn't tap her foot on the wooden floorboards to find the rhythm. She simply opened her mouth and let the sound out. The first note wasn't a scream or a shout. It was low, rich, and resonant, like a cello string being plucked deep in a cavern. It didn't just reach the front row, it seemed to wrap around the entire room. The effect was immediate and physical. The boy in the front row, who had been mid-whisper to his friend, froze. His mouth snapped shut. The girl checking her phone lowered her device slowly, her eyes drawn to the stage as if by a magnetic force. Mr. Henderson's pen hovered over his clipboard, then stopped. He looked up, his eyebrows furrowing, his expression of boredom replaced by a look of sharp confusion. She sang the opening verse, her voice clear and articulate, every word enunciated with a precision that cut through the dusty air of the auditorium. There was no microphone feedback, no screeching, just a pure, clean tone that filled the space. It was a song about drowning in the noise of the world, about screaming underwater while everyone else is breathing air. The irony of the lyrics wasn't lost on her, but she didn't perform them with anger. She sang them with a haunting sadness that made the air feel heavy. As she moved toward the chorus, she closed her eyes again, shutting out the harsh glare of the spotlights. She let her body sway slightly, finding the groove that she had practiced in the basement. She wasn't the girl in the hoodie anymore, she was a vessel for the melody. Then, she hit the chorus. The transition was seamless. Her voice swelled, growing in volume and intensity. It was a soaring, powerful sound that seemed too big to come from someone so small. It vibrated in the chests of the people sitting in the middle rows. The texture of her voice changed, gaining a raspy, soulful edge that sent shivers down the spines of the audience. The silence that had been skeptical and waiting for failure transformed into something else entirely. It became a silence of awe. 300 students, teachers, and judges sat in absolute stillness. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents, a sound usually drowned out by the restless shifting of a crowd. But nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody breathed. Mr. Henderson sat back in his chair, the pen slipping from his fingers and rolling onto the floor. He didn't notice. He just stared, his mouth slightly open. The choir director turned to him, eyes wide, mouthing the words, "Who is that?" The girl on stage didn't see any of this. She was lost in the music. She was remembering the cold basement steps, the feeling of being invisible, the loneliness of the lunch hours spent alone. She poured all of that isolation into the high notes, turning her pain into something beautiful that everyone could understand. She wasn't singing for attention anymore, she was singing to connect. And for the first time in her life, she was connecting. She reached the bridge of the song, the most difficult part. The music called for a long, sustained note that started soft and grew to a crescendo. She took a breath, expanding her lungs, and hit the note. It started as a whisper and then grew, stronger and stronger, holding steady without a tremble. It was a sound of defiance, a declaration of existence. She saw the boy from the hallway in her mind's eye. She saw the permission slip. She saw the gray sky outside. And then she pushed the sound higher, sending it soaring up to the rafters. It felt like she was shedding her skin, stripping away the shy, quiet exterior to reveal the fire that had been burning underneath all along. When she finally released the note, the silence rushed back in, but it was no longer empty. It was full. It was charged with the energy of what had just happened. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. She stood there for a moment, her chest heaving slightly, her hand still gripping the microphone stand. She slowly opened her eyes. The bright lights blinded her for a second, but as her vision adjusted, she looked out into the darkness. For 5 seconds, nobody did anything. It was as if the entire school had collectively forgotten how to be an audience. They were just individuals, stunned by the unexpected magnitude of the moment. Then, Mr. Henderson stood up. He didn't clap immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, nodding slowly. Then, he brought his hands together. It started as a slow, rhythmic clap. One person. Then two. Then the boy in the varsity jacket stood up in the front row, whistling loudly. The girl with the phone jumped to her feet. Within seconds, the applause wasn't just noise, it was a roar. It was a tidal wave of sound crashing over the stage, washing away the years of invisibility. The girl flinched slightly at the volume, a reflex she couldn't control, but then a small smile touched her lips. It wasn't a big, cheesy grin. It was just a tiny, genuine curve of the mouth. She felt the heat of the stage lights on her face, but for the first time, she didn't want to hide. She felt warm. She felt seen. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson. He was smiling now, a genuine, broad smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He picked up his clipboard and made a large, emphatic checkmark next to her name. She bowed her head slightly, a clumsy, awkward bow, but it was perfect. She turned and walked toward the side stairs. As she stepped off the stage and back into the shadows of the wings, her legs felt like jelly, but her heart was lighter than air. Backstage, the noise of the applause was muffled but still audible. She leaned against the brick wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest and buried her face in her hands. She wasn't crying, but she was shaking. After a few minutes, the footsteps approached. She looked up. It was the boy from the hallway. He didn't have a smirk on his face. He looked impressed. "You did it," he said simply. "You told them." She nodded, wiping her palms on her jeans. "Yeah. I did. Mr. Henderson wants to talk to you," he said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder toward the stage. "Something about opening the show." The girl took a deep breath. She stood up. She was still the same person who walked into the school that morning. She was still quiet. She still liked the basement. But something had changed. The world knew she was there now. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She adjusted the straps of her backpack and walked back toward the light, leaving the shadows behind her. The stage was waiting, and for the first time, she was ready to step into it.